Hey up YouTube! We're back again with episode 2 looking at the map of Neck End and District from the book Arfur Tow Crate in Staffordshire by Alan Povey and Andy Ridler. If you haven't seen episode 1, I'll post a link to it so you can catch up. This time we'll look at the landmarks in the area around Dishcloth End, looking towards Trentham, to see what used to be there, what's there now, and what happened. Right, let's get going. Name Dishcloth End is a curious name in itself. This is a local nickname for the area around Blurton and Fenton. I actually grew up in Blurton and I don't recall anyone referring to it as Dishcloth End in my lifetime. My research on the origin of this name on the internet has also been somewhat fruitless, but it's probably related to the nickname for Longton, Neck End, in some way. If anyone from Blurton or Fenton does know the origin of this name, then please let me know in the comments, because I'd really like to know too. First place we come to inside the Dishcloth End is Cocks-tobruk. Now, Cocks-tobruk runs through Blurton, just past the bottom of Longton Lane, or what's now Longton Road. This area was more or less where the more industrial landscape of Longton and Fenton met the more rural land around Blurton. It remained largely rural until the area expanded a lot in the post-war period, with new council estates being built around Hollybush and Swingle Hill. I remember as a kid the area around Cocks-tobruk was still largely untouched common land, where I used to go blackberry picking. The spoil heap from the former colliery, sometimes referred to as Hill 60 by the locals, a name probably picked up from soldiers coming back from Ypres in World War I, still standing proudly in the background. That all changed in the early 1990s when the housing estate that now covers some of the area was built, and the common land was more formally preserved as Cocks-tobruk Valley. The valley's now much more overgrown with greenery, which makes Hill 60 blend into the surroundings. Cocks-tobruk still flows through the nature reserve, and under Blurton Road through an underpass that occasionally gets clogged up and floods the main road. Next door to Cocks-tobruk, we've got Saff Ruck. A Saff Ruck is pottery slang for a spoil tip from a pot bank, or several pot banks, usually old rubbish thrown out like used saggers or rejects, or stuff that just can't be sold. As you can imagine, there were quite a lot of them in the potteries. The one in the photo is from Enza, but this particular Saff Ruck refers to the tip that was near the top of Cocks-tobruk Valley. I vaguely remember it still looking a bit like a tip in the early 90s before the A50 was built next to it. The mounds were known locally as the Camel's Humps, and were made up of a mixture of chaff, that's a word similar to saff, and byproducts of local pits and furnaces. The area is now mainly covered by greenery, as the nature reserve's been allowed to flourish, but you can still see the odd shard of pottery poking out every now and again, as these stills from a video by Staff's Transport show. I'll post a link to that video in the description if you want to watch it. Just up from here we come to Lionside. Now this is another one that I struggled with, as I'd never heard this term growing up nearby, but I suspect it refers to the railway line that ran through Fenton, and still does, though the station at Fenton closed down in 1961. This formed part of the old North Staffs Railway and would have seen considerable industrial traffic in the early 20th century, forming a vital artery for the pottery and coal industries. Heading down Blurton Bank now, we come to Sideway Boon Mill. Now these days, Sideway's better known for the local eyesore that's the incinerator, and the big roundabout that's always gridlocked on match days and at rush hours. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries it was better known for its bone mill. Bone mills were important to the pottery industry, used for grinding cattle bones for the production of bone china, and this was one of many in the city. I couldn't find any photographs of it actually, but I do remember playing on the wreck next door to it as a kid, when it was still standing. In 2025 the wreck's still there. Actually it's a much nicer playground now, but the bone mill was demolished in the late 90s to make way for the housing estate that's there now. After all this exploring, I think we should wet a whistle a bit, so let's head to Sowjer. Now this one took me a while to track down for a few reasons. One, it's quite hard to tell from the map exactly where it's pointing to, and two, Sowjer is a nickname for this pub, and it's not its most common nickname either. After appealing to the wisdom of the good folk on local Facebook groups, we finally established that it referred to the Abercrombie pub on Main Street, or formerly High Street in Hanford. Named after Ralph Abercrombie, a heroic commander of the British Army who served in many campaigns against French colonies in the Caribbean, and died of wounds after leading a daring landing party preceding the Battle of Alexandria in Egypt in 1801. It's one of many pubs and locations named after him up and down Britain. This pub was known as both the Abercrombie and the Sowjer, the Old Sowjer, and apparently, according to our map, Tin Sowjer, although the locals weren't as familiar with this nickname. Thanks to everyone who helped me out with this. I owe a few people a pint. Unfortunately, we won't be drinking it in the Sowjer, as it closed down in the late 70s and has since been demolished to make way for new housing. Speaking of folks who've got a lot of pubs named after them, let's take a slight detour now back towards Longton and head to Lord John Rustle. This pub was named after John Rustle, Earl Rustle, a renowned politician at the time of major reform in British politics in the first half of the 19th century. He made significant contributions to the Reform Act of 1832, which transformed the voting system in the country, redrawing constituency boundaries to make voter distribution more even, and relaxing the strict landowning criteria that was formerly required to vote. This made him a popular public figure early in his career, along with his vocal support for Catholic emancipation. He later went on to twice become Prime Minister, although this left his reputation somewhat tarnished due to his first administration being rocked by the significant events of the Irish famine and the revolutions of 1848 across Europe, and his second term by him fighting a losing battle over further reforms to Parliament, only for his political opponents to then take the credit. Nonetheless, his reputation as a reformer led to his name being attributed to many a pub across the country, including the one in question, which stood at the junction of Belgrave Road and Trentham Road in Dresden. It was demolished in the 1980s, and there's a small cul-de-sac now where it used to be. While we're on a roll, let's take our little pub crawl out towards Barlaston now, and as we head up Trentham Road, we're going to go past another local landmark, Gingerbread Ice. This is another building from before my time that I'm grateful to the good people of the Dresden and Trentham History Facebook groups for information about. Standing roughly next to where the Douglas Macmillan Hospice is now were two 18th century buildings that served the turnpike road that used to be Trentham Road in the 19th and early 20th centuries. One was a toll booth, known as the Tollgate House, which in some sources is also called the Gingerbread House. However, other sources suggest that Gingerbread House was actually a separate building on the other side of the road that sold refreshments, including gingerbread, funnily enough, to travellers, hence the name. The two buildings were demolished in the 1960s when the road was widened and the junction redesigned to better cater for the expanding housing estates nearby. The tollgate stood roughly where the grassy area is next to the traffic lights now, and the Gingerbread House would have been the other side of the road. Now we've filled up on gingerbread, let's head out towards Barlaston, where we'll continue our theme of pubs named after blokes who've got a lot of pubs named after them, and we'll nip in for a quick one at the Joker York. Now I always pronounce this Joker Yoke, but each to their own. Tomatoes, tomatoes and all that. The title of Duke of York was first created in 1385 and given to the fourth son of King Edward III, but the Duke of York that most pubs are named after was Frederick Augustus, Duke of York and Albany, a son of King George III, who's known for being a major figure in British history, serving as Commander-in-Chief during the Napoleonic Wars. Such was his influence, that he's described in the Oxford History of the British Army as doing more for the army than any one man has done in the whole of its history. The pub is an old-fashioned two-room pub next to the village green. I don't remember too much about it, to be honest. I'm not sure I've ever been in, although I've been past it quite a few times. But it's refreshing to see that it's still open today. While we're in Barlaston, it'd be rude not to call in at the Plume of Fithers. I've got many fond memories of visiting the Plume of Fithers as a kid. My grandad would drive us down to Method Locks, where he'd use his gift of the gab to persuade a passing narrowboat to take us down the canal for a ride, where we'd get off at the Plume of Fithers and have some chips in the beer garden. I remember it as your typical local village pub. The interior was a bit shabby, food was your basic stuff, and it had a tatty pool table that I played my first ever game of pool on, with the landlord grimacing nervously in the background. Good times. These days it doesn't look like the sort of place where you'd expect to find men behaving badly. But you'd be wrong, as it's now owned by local celebrity actor Neil Morrissey, who shows up for personal appearances and meet and greets every now and again, and it's a more polished restaurant-type pub these days. Moving on now, we'll head down Trentham Road towards the Trentham Estate, where we'll encounter Trentum Traffy Klates. This notorious road junction was outside the main entrance to Trentham Gardens, as Longton Road joins the A34. Previously the entrance to the estate owned by the Duke of Sutherland, it was open to the public in 1932. At first there were no traffic calming measures here, but in the 1960s, as car ownership was on the rise, some traffic lights were deemed necessary. These did the job for quite a while, but over time, as car ownership increased, along with the popularity of Trentham Gardens as a destination, the junction became a bottleneck. I vaguely remember the traffic lights still being there as a kid, although my mind might be playing tricks on me there, but the junction's now controlled by a huge roundabout, which is able to manage the much higher volume of traffic much better than the previous lights were, although it still often gets backed up whenever the Trentham Estate has a big event on. Turning right at Trentum Traffy Klates, we'll go past the Poacher's Cottage on the left, and we'll come to Dog Kennel Lane. Now called Whitmore Road, this popular rat run to the M6 used to go past the old dog kennels that belonged to Trentham Hall, that were built in the 1840s, and enlarged to include lodgings for huntsmen in the 1860s, becoming quite a sizable complex. The lodges and kennels survived into the Edwardian period, but are no longer there, being demolished and replaced by modern housing in the latter half of the 20th century, save for one old cottage that survives. The kennels may be gone, but the name still lives on in popular vernacular. In fact, I actually had to look up what the road was called on Google Maps because I've only ever known it as Dog Kennel Lane. And from here we head out of the city towards Ayrshire, or Ayrshire. And that's pretty much it for this portion of the map. I hope you've enjoyed this little tour of Dishcloth End and the more posh end of Trentham. There'll be more episodes to follow where we'll cover the other portions of the map. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you get notifications and don't miss them. And I'll see thee later for episode 3.